Welcome to a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to talk to you about potentially powerful pairings this coming season for Memphis, folks that maybe we haven't had a chance to see play together because they're new to the team or they're going to have a new role this coming season in the Grizzlies rotation. We're going to lead off with a wonderful poll question from this past Friday, taking a look at what all-time Memphis wing would be the best fit for this current roster. I'm Joe Mullinax. This is Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Again, I am your host for this episode of the show, Joe Mullinax, flying solo, my wonderful partner, DeMichael Cole, still enjoying a well-deserved break. Shout out to DeMichael. He of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He is phenomenal. He covers the Memphis Grizzlies for that publication, but he has been running around like a crazy person doing work covering these Grizzlies, and he deserves some time off. So you'll be with me the next few shows without old DeMichael, and he'll be back later on this week to talk Grizzlies basketball with me as we close out January, Freudian slip, colder weather. That's what I'm dreaming of. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code Locked On. Again, on Friday's episode, I mentioned how we were going to tackle potentially powerful pairings, folks that haven't had a chance to play as much together for a variety of reasons. And we're going to get to that later on in the show. And we're also going to get to some interesting hot button conversation starter from Twitter, or whatever Twitter calls itself now. But first, I want to remind you that we are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our everydayers, folks that make us part of their NBA content consumption each and every day. DeMichael appreciates you. I appreciate you. It's wonderful to have you with us on this Monday episode of the show. At BCM Grizzlies, the website that I once ran, Grizzly Bear Blues. I am a Memphis Grizzlies columnist over at Bluff City Media now. Bluff City Media has taken on what was formerly known as Grizzly Bear Blues over as part of SB Nation. I'm also a contributor over at SB Nation still. I ran Grizzly Bear Blues for 5 years as part of that network. Now Grizzly Bear Blues is part of Bluff City Media. I'm a writer and columnist for that site. And whoever tweeted this out, kudos to them, because I thought this was a wonderful Flashback Friday poll. And this is at BCM Grizzlies on Twitter from this past Friday. If you could add the best one-year version of a past Grizzlies wing to this year's roster, who would it be? I'm not going to deal with the others that people may have mentioned because I think these four are pretty solid choices. 2003, 2004, James Posey. 2005, 2006, Shane Battier. 2010, 2011, Rudy Gay. 2004, 2005, Mike Miller. All four of those are good, and I think they're worth discussing. And you, dear listener, dear viewer, are probably thinking to yourself, well, I read the comments on YouTube. I know that you're really into Rudy Gay and other people aren't. I listen each and every day wherever I get my podcasts, and I heard you on Friday or over the weekend talking about how much you wanted Rudy Gay back in Memphis. I'm guessing you picked 2010, 2011 Rudy Gay. Two things on that. First, calm down, everyone that got mad at me saying that Rudy Gay sucks. I'm not saying that he's good. I said bring him in on a training camp deal. He's almost certainly going to get waived. You give him a chance to show he can still play. He fills out the training camp roster. He puts on the Grizzlies jersey a time or two once more, and you move him along. You give him a chance to prove he's still an NBA player. And if he's not an NBA player, he gets to finish his career as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies. No harm, no foul. Some of you just like to yell at me, okay? Second thing on that, maybe this part will surprise you. Maybe you're assuming that I'm going to choose that 2011 version of Rudy Gay because that's the guy that helped me fall in love with the Grizzlies in the first place all those years ago. No. In fact, of the four options listed, and that's why I really like this poll, Rudy Gay is at the bottom of my list because, well, Rudy Gay is an effective scorer in the 2011-2010, version of him. was one of the most efficient seasons of his career. Again, the best year he had in Memphis as a member of the Grizzlies. While he could score at 3 levels, while he was a bigger forward frame that could play the 4 in theory, still had that lateral quickness and athleticism to defend on the perimeter. I would want each of the other 3. And here's why. Because while Rudy Gay was an effective 3-level scorer, he was not elite from beyond the arc. That was not something that, even in that one season where he was successful, that was never a strength of his. His game was isolation. His game was creating off the dribble for himself, getting an open look, especially there on the baseline, mid-range jumper kind of stuff. That was his strength. The other 3 guys, all their seasons and their overall skill sets, 3-point shooting was a much larger factor. And again, if we're talking about fitting in with this version of the Memphis Grizzlies, Rudy Gay's 4th for me. Who would be 3rd? Mike Miller, because Mike Miller, obviously one of the best shooters, if not the best shooter in Memphis Grizzlies history. Desmond Bane may already have something to say about that, but he almost certainly will after signing that contract extension. Bane will almost certainly supplant him in that role if he hasn't already done so. Miller's 3-point shooting would certainly be a wonderful addition. That spacing to help John Morant and Desmond Bane, who's become a solid secondary facilitator, even Jaren Jackson Jr., creating off the dribble, depending on matchups. Spacing is key, and Mike Miller would certainly produce that. So why is Mike Miller not higher on my list? Because the other 2 guys bring that 3-point shooting possibility while also being better defenders. While Miller gets kind of a bad rep for what he was defensively in that first stint. His second stint, he was terrible defensively, right? But he was at the end of his career when he came in during those grit and grind years later on in Memphis. His first stop in Memphis, he was an above-average defender combined with his elite 3-point shooting. Makes sense. Battier, better defender, still was capable of hitting the 3, providing that spacing. I think he's a better fit because he's better defensively. And the same can be said for my number 1 choice. And I want to give exactly, I was thinking through this because, again, when I became a Grizzlies fan, I did my own research. I did various things studying Grizztory 12 years ago now. And I knew, not these exact numbers, but I knew this was roughly what James Posey did in 2003, 2004. But I want to credit former host here on Locked On Grizzlies, Sean Coleman, my colleague over at Bluff City Media, at StatsSAC. Though it was 20 years ago, James Posey's 2003-2004 season was truly one of the best in Grizzlies franchise history. 48% from the field, 39% from 3, 61.4% true shooting. So this is a guy who can score the basketball in a variety of ways, wasn't just a 3-point shooter. And when he was shooting 3-point shots, he was converting them at a high clip. He did all of this, as Sean points out, while playing elite defense. He missed the all-defensive team that season by 2 votes. So this is a significantly better version of this past season's Dillon Brooks. And if you put a much better version of Dillon Brooks on this Grizzlies roster, that Grizzlies starting lineup, and remember, Posey, 6'8", bigger frame even than Dillon. To me, that's an NBA Finals team. I thought Posey was that good. Posey, a current coach now with the Washington Wizards, he would bring a level of basketball intelligence that obviously Battier also had. Mike Miller, of course, had. He was a coach, worked locally in that way with the Memphis Tigers, as many of you probably know. So not to say that Rudy Gay doesn't have those attributes. He's obviously a veteran in the league. If he is no longer going to be in the NBA, he had a tremendous NBA career. But Miller, Battier, Posey, I think all of those guys are better fits. And again, Posey combines the 3-point spacing, giving as much room for guys like John Morant, Desmond Bane, and others to operate in, while also being an elite defensive player. You have to combine those 2 things. He is the bigger wing that I've been clamoring for. That version of James Posey, that 2003-2004 season version. So kudos to Bluff City Media. Kudos to @BCM Grizzlies for a wonderful Friday flashback poll. I promise we'll get to our duos that I mentioned on Friday's edition of the show, but I wanted to weigh in with my thoughts on that. They had another question version that involved the current Grizzly that you'd want on the core 4. I'm going to save that for when DeMichael's back. I think that's a good topic for DeMichael. I figured since my answer was a guy from 20 years ago, DeMichael perhaps wouldn't have as much insight, if you know what I mean. And you could tell him that I said that, young bull. If I was in high school when James Posey was balling out for the Memphis Grizzlies, DeMichael was what, in preschool, kindergarten, something like that. Enough old guy jokes here on Locked On Grizzlies. Let's get into what we said on Friday we were going to talk about, and that is potentially powerful pairings, guys that are going to work together for the first time extensively, more than likely this coming season, not assuming there are no injuries. And I'm interested in how those duos are going to flesh out. We're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by PrizePicks. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, Joe, the NBA season is over. There's not even summer league basketball for me to do some player projections on. Who am I going to more or less with now over at PrizePicks as part of my daily fantasy entries? You can do it with all sorts of sports like the WNBA, NASCAR, Major League Baseball ramping up into high gear. NFL training camps are opening in the next week. So before you know it, it'll be fall in football, all sorts of different things that you can do. Start getting used to logging into PrizePicks. I love how easy it is. I love how you compete against the projections available, not against other people. It's safe, it's fast, operational in over 30 states as well as in Canada. And again, you can make an entry in 60 seconds or less. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. We're talking potentially powerful pairings for the Memphis Grizzlies. Next, stay with us here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax. I am your only host this time around. I missed Michael Cole of the Commercial Appeal terribly, my co-host here on Locked On Grizzlies. But again, a well-deserved vacation, well-deserved time off for DeMichael, and I know he misses me terribly. I know that for a fact. But I also know he's resting. He'll be wonderful to have back on the show later on this week. But you are still with me starting off your Monday with some Locked On Grizzlies consumption. And I appreciate you being with us each and every day as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Potentially powerful pairings. Obviously, James Posey and anybody, like I mentioned earlier in the show, would have been a powerful pairing if that occurred. But we got to get back to the real world, right? Theoreticals and dreams are fun to discuss at the top of podcasts, and they're good to have in your back pocket when content starts running dry in late July and August during an NBA season, or off season, I should say. But there has to be some semblance of what the Grizzlies are going to be. And obviously, the roster seems pretty much set. DeMichael and I talked about last week, Josh Christopher, Isaiah Todd, those seem to be the two most likely waiving scenarios. G.G. Jackson will likely get that third and final two-way deal. Aside from a training camp type contract or an Exhibit 10 type deal for someone with the Memphis hustle, the Grizzlies are locked in. And again, as I mentioned, maybe they get involved in the Damian Lillard or James Harden sweepstakes, not to acquire those guys, but to be a third team and get a young wing that fits that Posey-esque frame, at least. Maybe not Posey-esque quality of play, but the build, the bigger wing, a veteran version of that. That is something that would be more attractive to me, as I mentioned on Friday's show. But let's say they don't do that. Some guys that maybe we haven't talked about as much in terms of being interesting dynamic duo possibilities. And for me, the key hole to all this, the piece that gets revolved around with this type of a conversation is Marcus Smart, because he's obviously the biggest new name coming to Memphis. He's the guy that hopefully checks a lot of boxes: elite perimeter defender, backup point guard, can do a lot of different things as a combo player next to John Morant. He is going to have the most opportunity to be a player that has a couple of different solid dynamic pairings to play off of. And the first name I'm going to throw out there might surprise you a little bit. I'm excited to see Marcus Smart with Xavier Tillman Sr. And here's why. You, dear listener, dear viewer, are probably thinking that you're most excited to see Marcus Smart alongside Jaren Jackson Jr. And sure, the last two defensive players of the year on the same floor together, extremely rare. It may have never happened in NBA history. I apologize, I don't have that in front of me, but I know that it hasn't happened in a long time if it's happened at all. So to have both of those guys on the floor at the same time, Memphis likely will have a top 5 defense. You got to remember Desmond Bane, an above average to good defender now. Steven Adams, assuming his health, very good defensively. The Grizzlies are a really good defensive team, at least in terms of personnel. And we know Taylor Jenkins is going to prioritize that. So why do I say Smart and Tillman? For the exact same reason I would say Smart and Jackson Jr., but with a different perspective. Jaren is an elite rim protector. Jaren is somebody who is going to, in FIBA, when FIBA gets started here in the next few weeks, and DeMichael and I talk about the FIBA rules of basketball where there's no goaltending, Jaren's going to dominate that. Jaren's going to start at center for the United States of America in the upcoming FIBA basketball tournament. That's really cool to say out loud. And it's true. Jaren is going to dominate at that level defensively. And I think he's going to have some success on the offensive end as well. Dark horse MVP season incoming, perhaps, for Jaren Jackson Jr. But while Jaren is switchable, while Jaren is a guy that you can ask to defend a guy like a LeBron James or a Kevin Durant, that's not Jaren's strength. You're not utilizing Jaren most effectively when you do that. As we saw in the playoffs, something that Xavier Tillman is able to do at a high level, utilizing him most effectively, is defending bigger forwards and wings like LeBron James. Not to say that X was perfect in that way, but Taylor Jenkins, the head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, clearly felt that X was a better option to defend LeBron James than Dillon Brooks was. Dillon Brooks was getting cooked consistently by LeBron. Xavier Tillman Sr., a center, at least in terms of position, in a positionless era of NBA basketball, Tillman got the LeBron assignment, and Tillman did better. Again, not perfect, but he did better. He has a switchability to him, which is good because he's undersized, right? At 6'8", he's not going to be the rim protector that Jaren Jackson Jr. is. So he, alongside Brandon Clark, but Clark's not going to be available to start the season due to his Achilles injury. They have to be switchable because if they're not, they don't really have a strength to their defensive game. Tillman can defend perimeter players, and Marcus Smart, depending on the big. We have seen Marcus Smart, maybe not Joel Embiid consistently, but a stretch four, a 6'9" type of forward, Marcus Smart is taking on those responsibilities. So depending on the lineups, depending on the matchups, and again, if X is in, unless Steven Adams gets injured again, which we certainly don't want, it'll be a reserve kind of role, a combination of reserves and starters. To see Smart alongside X switching things defensively more often than not, anytime that they're able to do that, that's a wrinkle that we haven't seen from bigs in Memphis consistently. Steven Adams, more of a drop defender. Jonas Valanciunas before him, more of a drop defender. Even Jaren Jackson Jr., who is capable of switching again as a rim protector, makes a little more sense for him to drop. For switchable mixing up of scheme, I like the idea of Smart and X together. They can take on different pick and roll combinations and give those guys a little bit of a different look. They can even blitz some of those pick and roll handlers and see if they can create turnovers in that way. Another person I'm excited to see Marcus Smart next to that maybe is a little bit off the beaten path is not Luke Kennard. It's not Jake LaRavia. I'll talk about both of those guys in our final segment of today's show. It is Zaire Williams, because Zaire is a guy who desperately needs to see a smaller body be aggressive at the rim and be aggressive at and around defensively and playing with a level of effort that Marcus Smart brings to the table. Zaire Williams has all the tools in the world. If we're talking strictly about talent, all the things we talked about last week with Zaire versus Jake versus Roddy, it wouldn't be a contest. Zaire is the most talented of those three in terms of physically, whatever gods may be given ability. But Zaire has not been able to piece those things together. So of all of those bigger wing options that Memphis has decided to see if one of them sticks, to give them consistent minutes in that role, even if it's not as a starter, but as a bigger wing on the perimeter, one of those guys is going to have to play. And Zaire has the tools. Marcus Smart has similar tools. How he could react alongside Smart as a facilitator of offense, as someone who perhaps in the mid-range can get himself going a little bit off of a Marcus Smart. Because you got to remember, Smart's not an elite three-point shooter, but he's capable of knocking down the shot, and more so than Dillon Brooks even. So with that in mind, you have someone who can give that spacing more so and allow for Zaire to potentially find his footing, not have to take on the toughest defensive assignment. Can he be more dominant in that place as a 6'9" true perimeter player? He's not a 6'9" combo forward. He's a 6'9" perimeter wing. So letting him be that guy and not have to defend a Steph Curry, not have to defend someone of that ilk, if it is indeed Zaire that wins that role, I think that's really going to help him take off and get him to a place of confidence. He doesn't have to be more than he can possibly be right here and right now, and that is extremely valuable for these Memphis Grizzlies. So you can put Marcus Smart with a lot of these guys, right? A lot of different ways that this can kind of flesh out and work itself out. But those are the two, again, off the beaten path, assuming Tillman is a guy that continues to stay in the rotation. We've talked about how Kenneth Lofton Jr. can maybe take some of those minutes if he shows that switchability defensively because they have similar frames. And then Zaire Williams, assuming he's that guy. Maybe he's not. We'll talk about all that next. And not next, but throughout this offseason. We talked about it last week. Assuming Zaire is that guy, how it all is going to fit together. We're talking about another key Grizzlies player and a couple of dudes that are going to look mighty good alongside him, at least theoretically speaking. We're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies, finishing up this Monday edition of the podcast. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, not joined by DeMichael Cole. I miss him terribly. I hope he comes back soon. I know he'll be back later this week. My co-host of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer. He deserves a vacation. He's currently on it. And I am with you on this Monday edition, Joe Mullinax of Bluff City Media, also of SB Nation in terms of being a contributor there. I mentioned Marcus Smart being a key cog of a new guy coming in. No disrespect to Derrick Rose. I don't think he's that level of player, right? He'll get some run when John Morant is suspended. But if come January, February, trade deadline, all-star break, if Derrick Rose is still in the rotation, something's gone horribly wrong, at least in my opinion. So no disrespect to Derrick Rose. Going to put him aside for this one. I'm going to talk about someone who has been out for longer than any of us thought he would be, but should theoretically, and he's popped up on social media with Santi Aldama in Spain and doing some workouts, Steven Adams. Steven Adams should be back. And when Steven Adams returns, he is going to bring an elite level of screen setting. He was one of the best screen assisters in the NBA this past season, an elite level of offensive rebounding. He was the best offensive rebounder in the NBA this past season per game. And Domantas Sabonis of the Kings had a really strong season too. But if we're talking, Sabonis is the key cog in the Sacramento offense. Adams was literally the rebounder. And because of that, he's elite in those specific skills, whereas Sabonis is an elite overall player, if that makes sense. Adams hasn't been around. I'm excited to watch Steven Adams with a bunch of different guys because he's that vital to screen setting, creating spacing on pick and rolls, for shooters, off-ball screens. And because of that, that last point in particular, the off-ball screen, creating space for shooters, I want to see Steven Adams and Luke Kennard. Now, you've probably heard that before, right? That's not a groundbreaking thought. But I'm going to mix it up a little bit. You assume Luke Kennard, off-ball screen, coming around, pinned down, whatever it might be, getting an open shot. That's probably how you foresee Luke Kennard. I, on the other hand, see Luke Kennard and the value that he brings to the Memphis Grizzlies as a facilitator. What he did in Detroit, what he didn't do in Los Angeles as a member of the Clippers. I want to see more of that Luke Kennard. And I think early on we will get a chance to see that Luke Kennard due to the Morant suspension, almost by necessity or out of necessity. So that would mean Luke Kennard, Steven Adams pick and rolls. And what I am excited about with that is, again, creating space. Steven Adams is elite at being a large human being. Very good at it. I have mad respect for what Steven Adams does, creating room for his screen partners to operate in. That is going to help Kennard immensely as he gets back into a more prominent role in that way. And Zach Kleiman, the Grizzlies GM, when they acquired Luke Kennard, talked about wanting Luke to be that type of player where he can still get back and be a secondary facilitator. Somebody starts a set, Luke gets it on the wing, has Steven Adams come over to him, two-man game. Kennard obviously won't have anybody go under on him on a pick and roll concept defensively because he'll just shoot the three, and 40-some%, almost 50% of the time, Kennard makes that shot. But what does that space allow? Whether they collapse on Adams, who's not a bad finisher at the rim in his own right, whether Desmond Bane is out there with him, Marcus Smart, who can hit shots in the corner, whoever might be out there, how that space is manifested and made malleable by someone like Luke Kennard is something that I am very excited to see because I am a Luke Kennard believer. I think that Luke Hatmaker of Bluff City Media did a great job writing about Luke Kennard as a sixth man of the year candidate. I agree. I think there's a real possibility that he is able to be that for these Memphis Grizzlies if they utilize him properly offensively. We saw the immense impact that he had in that Lakers series. If Luke Kennard is out there, Memphis has a better chance. Doesn't mean they win, but Luke Kennard was one of the most important players in that series for Memphis. Another guy who's going to be important, if it's not Zaire on the perimeter, is Jake LaRavia. And I'm really excited to see Jake LaRavia alongside Steven Adams as well. For a similar reason to Kennard, right, in terms of that space and how he's able to be malleable with it. But as we saw in Summer League, Jake LaRavia has grown as a scorer on all three levels. That's not Kennard's strength. You're not worrying about Luke Kennard driving off of a crossover and getting to the rim and finishing an and one layup. He can physically do that potentially, but not consistently. Jake LaRavia might have that skill set. He might have that toolkit in his bag. And if he is able to do that, theoretically speaking, he can do more with the room that is created by Steven Adams than Luke Kennard can. Whether it's off a screen, on ball in the pick and roll, if LaRavia can truly continue to manifest that three-level scoring ability, and if he does that, he'll be the guy, not Zaire, because it's very unlikely that Zaire Williams ever becomes the three-point shooter that Jake LaRavia is. That's just probably not going to happen. Zaire has never been that level of shooter. LaRavia has almost always been that level of shooter. And don't tell me the stats from Summer League. Nobody cares. Look at his shooting form. Look at his stroke. Look at how he gets lift off the shot. Look at how he shoots from free throw line. All the mechanics are what tell you whether or not the guy can shoot the three. All right. He's young. I'm confident the shot will eventually go down. The fact that he can get to the rim, that he's made that a priority, the fact that he has some mid-range aspects to his game, similar to what Zaire already has. But again, Zaire can finish at the rim, but so can LaRavia. The thing that separates is that three-point shot. And LaRavia will have all sorts of different things that he'll be able to do thanks to that Steven Adams size and screen setting. So Kennard and LaRavia, fascinating in that way, at least in my opinion, because as Steven Adams sets these screens, we've seen what Joe Morant can do. He's able to get to the basket at ease. He was one of the greatest scorers in the rim and around the paint in the NBA a couple of years ago. That doesn't happen without Steven Adams. It just doesn't. Obviously, LaRavia and Kennard don't have that type of skill set, but what they do provide potentially is scoring from range. And when you combine that skill with a bit of a handle, bit of a facilitation aspect, the fact that Steven Adams is driving to the rim and somebody has to collapse on that, maybe somebody's going to flash out and get a hand in front of the face and not allow the clean three-point shot. But there is going to be more room than there was for Luke Kennard last season, for Jake LaRavia in the G League, for anybody really, because of how good Adams is at creating that space for his pick and roll partners. So I'm excited to see that. I'm excited to have Steven Adams back in general, but I think those two players in particular could be real assets to Memphis in those particular sets with Steven Adams. What they do with the space is going to be up to them, but it's going to be there. And it's going to be different than what a Desmond Bane or a John Morant might do because of their particular talents that they bring to the Grizzlies roster. Thank you so much for being with me on this Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. On Tuesday's show, we're going to talk a little bit about the way that the Memphis roster looks, how the size of the contracts, different types of trade ideas. Again, I don't think they're going to make any trades, but it's important to point out a name like John Conchar. I think I mentioned in last week's show, you could trade him for a 2026 second round pick now, and most people would take that deal that have roster space. Well, why is that, right? Why does that matter? We'll take a closer look at that, how the roster and the money on the contracts is actually constructed. We'll talk about that and more on our Tuesday edition of the podcast. I hope you'll join me for that. And I hope DeMichael is having a wonderful vacation. I hope you are doing well wherever you are listening or watching, free and available, wherever you get your podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Again, like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, check us out on YouTube, all those fun things. It is all good here on Locked On Grizzlies as we close out the month of July over the next week or so. Again, Mr. Michael, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I know I enjoyed talking to you, dear listener, dear viewer. I appreciate you taking the time to make me and us here at Locked On Grizzlies part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption. I hope you're going to do it again tomorrow, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Until then, I'm Joe Mullinax. Stay locked in. This is Locked On.